and stop them from stealing our Electoral College, which really is one of the pillars of federalism, of our unique system of states in our Constitution. So that's what I'm going to talk about here tonight, but that is just to say, I really personally believe this is one of the most important parts we have left of our constitutional structure of states.
You all have heard about this thing called the Electoral College, and you've heard about this challenge to the national popular vote. It's kind of a big deal, and there's a lot of movement going on about it around the country. So Trent England, I'm sure that you've heard him online, you've heard him on the radio and various things. He is the executive vice president of OCPA, and you head up the Save Our States project that they're working on. So Trent's going to come to the platform and talk to us about the national popular vote, what's going on with that, and how we can get involved. So Trent, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Lori. Thank you to all of you. It's great to be here, and I always love to talk about the Electoral College because it is actually one of my favorite topics. And I was thinking about this. It was 5 years ago. I was minding my own business just outside of Seattle, working on state-based policy up in Washington State, which is where I grew up. And I had done a stint out in Washington, D.C., and worked at the Heritage Foundation, and decided the states are where the action is. I want to get back to the states, and I was minding my own business out there. And folks at OCPA called me up and said, we've got a position we think you'd be really interested in it. We want somebody who can do constitutional law and policy and federalism and the founding and principles and all that. And I said, okay, on one condition. You have to let me bring my Save Our States project down there, because nobody else was focused really at that time on defending the Electoral College. And I give a lot of credit to my boss back there, Bob Williams, who founded the state-based think tank in Washington State. He'd been at a legislative conference, an NCSL, National Conference of State Legislators conference, I think in 2006. And he heard somebody from this National Popular Vote organization speak. And Bob realized these guys are clever, and they're well-funded, and they're serious, and this is a big threat. And so he and I cooked up the Save Our States project as a way to track these guys around the country and stop them from stealing our Electoral College, which really is one of the pillars of federalism, of our unique system of states in our Constitution. So that's what I'm going to talk about here tonight, but that is just to say, I really personally believe this is one of the most important parts we have left of our constitutional structure of states. So where did all this come from? I mean, Beto O'Rourke says the Electoral College is it's just slavery. It's just about slavery. And you hear this all the time on the left, that this is all, of course, you hear this all the time on the left about anything. If you're a leftist, it's so easy, right? Because any part of the Constitution you don't like is slavery. So you don't have to make an argument or know anything at all, right? It's just slavery. So, I mean, here's the history of the Electoral College in a nutshell. Right? The framers of our Constitution weren't sure. I mean, at first they weren't sure whether they wanted to have a president at all, which makes a lot of sense, right? They just fought a war against a king, and they were very concerned about monarchy, and they understood that they understood the threat of government, the threat of government power, and of centralization. And they thought about a lot of different ideas. And the states, by by this point, obviously we were under the Articles of Confederation for a little while, and the states had experimented with some different models, and they realized, at least, especially, you see this division when you read the debates of the framers and the debates around the Constitution. There's a division between those who were in the Continental Congress during the Revolution and those who were in the Continental Army during the Revolution. And a lot of those who were in the Continental Army said, sure, Britain was our adversary, but our real enemy was Congress. We don't want a committee running government. Right? At the end of the day, the buck has got to stop somewhere. Like, Harry Truman and the famous sign on his desk, the buck stops here. It's got to stop somewhere. We need the people's representatives to have the power of the purse, to make our laws, right? And we're going to set up Congress with a House elected by the people and a Senate elected by the states, and they're going to make the laws, and they're really in charge, right? But who's going to carry out those laws? We want to have one president of the United States. So they worked their way to that. But how do you choose that person? And they considered a lot of different options. They considered popular vote. I mean, that was one thing they considered, and they did not reject it because it would be too hard. This is another thing that people on the left say that actually doesn't, if you think it through, it doesn't make any sense. That it would be too hard because the states were already having state elections, right? It wouldn't have been impossible to have a national popular vote among the 13 original states because all those states were having elections. All you'd have to do is just transmit the results of those elections. It would take a little bit of time, but it would not impossible. But they were very concerned that if you had direct popular election of the president, that office would be subject to intrigue. And this does relate a little bit to challenges in technology at the time, although you might think modern technology makes this more likely rather than less. But the concern was, what can people in New York really know about a candidate from South Carolina or vice versa? And we don't want, one of the concerns sounds very contemporary. We don't want collusion. I don't think they use the word collusion, but I mean, literally, like, this is something you find in the Federalist Papers. We don't want foreign governments trying to manipulate people, right? We think that we should have a safer selection system for the president. And one thing they did not believe that I think is lost a little bit today. We were talking about this a little bit earlier. They did not have this, what I think is a weird belief, that the president is supposed to represent us, right? They actually created in Article 1 the branch of government that's supposed to represent us, the House of Representatives, right? Helpfully named, and the Senate represents the states. I mean, the president is a hired hand. He's supposed to do the job well, right? Because I mean, at the end of the day, I mean, the idea that whether you're talking about 20 million people or 300 million people, the idea that we're all going to come together and elect one person and feel like that person's our representative is kind of silly. Right? What you want is an executive who does a good job. You think about, if you're at a big public corporation and you're choosing a CEO, do you want a CEO who represents the shareholders or the workers? You want a CEO who's going to be a good CEO, right? The framers of the Constitution wanted a president who could do a good job. So how do you do that? They thought about having governors elect the president, but they didn't want to have too close a connection between the states and the executive, right? They wanted the executive to have some independence, and they thought about Congress. Maybe we should just have Congress elect the president. But there again, right, the problem is the president would just be Congress's guy. He'd be Congress's lackey, especially when he was coming up for re-election. He would have no independence, right? And so they didn't want that. But then they realized, we've already hammered out this deal to create the Congress. What we really need to do, and this is what the Electoral College is, we need to create a Congress to elect the president and then just have it go away right away. So the incumbent president is not going to know who those people are ahead of time, and those people aren't going to have any other power, right, to hold over the head of the president or vice versa after the election. I mean, the Electoral College is exactly that. It is essentially a Congress that comes together just to elect the president of the United States and then dissolves. The math is based on Congress. And this is why, the people on the left get away with saying, well, it's about slavery. Well, look, slavery was an issue at the Constitutional Convention, right? That is inescapable. But if people are upset about that, they should throw out Congress, right? Because it's Congress, it's the compromise that created Congress that had to do with slavery. Congress just became the foundation of the Electoral College because they'd already hammered that out, right? So it's at least another step more attenuated from that compromise. So how did it work in the beginning? And some of you who know history know this. Some of the fun intrigue in early, in our early republic. Initially, the states could appoint their electors however they wanted, and some states held elections from the beginning. Some state legislatures just appointed electors, and but the whoever got the most votes became president. and whoever got the second most votes became vice president, which turned out to be a big mess, right? Yeah, I mean, just ask John Adams, and then just ask Thomas Jefferson, right? This led to the one real modification of the Electoral College, which comes along after the election of 1800, the 12th Amendment, which says, no, okay, the electors are going to cast one vote for president and one vote for vice president, and we're not going to have this runner-up thing. And this really forms the basis for our national two-party system. And I've got to put system in air quotes because, it's not in the Constitution that we have a two-party system. It's the natural result of the kind of election systems that we have. It's not having a parliament, not having proportional representation, but having elections where at the end of the day, one person wins that election. And so this became the basis for our two-party system, for having presidents and vice presidents run as a ticket. And over time, over the 19th century, states all eventually wound up going to what we have today in almost every state, including Oklahoma. 48 states use winner take all. Right, we all get together. We vote in the election. Whichever candidate wins the most votes, that candidate's political party gets their electors elected. And even there, I think maybe I'm going too fast. I'm getting some confused looks. Who's been to a state political party convention in a presidential election year? Okay, so just a few. So if you were there, you remember one of the things you did was you nominated electors, right? You nominated president. That's where presidential electors come from. Some people don't realize that, because we tend to just talk about electoral votes, but electors are real people. They're actually elected officials of the state of Oklahoma and every other state for a very brief period of time. So after the presidential election, so in 2020, after the presidential election, the Secretary of State will tally up the votes, and once that election is certified, there will be a certification in the election for U.S. Senator, and they'll issue a certificate of election to the U.S. Senator, and that's the official document that says, whoever wins the Senate race in Oklahoma is elected senator. Well, they'll issue those certificates of election to 7 people. Probably Republicans. It's pretty easy to guess that in Oklahoma these days, right? Whoever gets nominated by the Republican convention next year, right, assuming the election goes that way, they will actually get a certificate of election just like a candidate for U.S. Senator, just like a candidate for U.S. House, and they will be elected the elector, or one of the electors for the state of Oklahoma. Does that make sense? Is that okay? Good deal. Yeah, so much of this, one of the problems we have with the Electoral College is it really works so well that we never have to think about it. You think about that, right? We have, lots of people, lots of us could discourse on the First Amendment because the First Amendment law is all messed up, right? And it's ignored and it's abused, and there's all this controversy. The Electoral College, actually, all this just goes on in the background, right? And most Americans haven't had to think about it very much. And so then something like the 2000 election happens, which I realized the other day I had to explain to the interns in my office. And then we explained Y2K. It was a good afternoon, but and all of a sudden people say I've never heard about this, or I didn't realize this could happen, and it's actually a symptom of how well that part of the Constitution works. Alexander Hamilton wrote in the Federalist Papers about the Electoral College. He said, "If it be not perfect, it is at least excellent." Isn't that a great quote? And he pointed out, and this is true, that it was one of the least controversial parts of the Constitution. So the Anti-Federalists looked at it and said, yeah, respect states as states, two-step process. We want somebody who can do the job. Anti-Federalists were mostly fine with it, right? There was a question over how much it would deadlock, and states going to winner take all, and the development of having two political parties basically eliminated or dramatically reduced the chance of the Electoral College deadlocking, which then sends the election to the House of Representatives. And we're not going to talk about that because that has its own complexity. So what's the history of the Electoral? So that's where it came from. How's it actually worked over time? We know about 2000 and 2016, and I'll talk about those just a little bit in a minute. But there were elections before that where the candidate who got the most popular votes wasn't the candidate who won the Electoral College. So we've seen this controversy in the past. And sometimes people point to the contest between John Quincy Adams and Andrew Jackson as the first time that happened. That's not actually true, because some states were still, remember, states the legislature could directly appoint electors. And some states were still doing, there wasn't a national popular vote in 1824. So there wasn't, John Quincy Adams received less popular votes only because some of the states that supported him didn't hold a popular election, right? So that one doesn't actually make sense. I hear people say, there have been all these elections. Okay, but when it did happen, at least on paper, although this is another one where the devil is in the details, is 1876. So anybody here can picture a political map after the Civil War. Democrats intensely popular in the South. Republicans more popular in the North, but not with the same intensity as Democrats, right? That's the basic political map after the Civil War. And Democrats were struggling to return to being a national political party after the Civil War. And in 1876, it finally looked like, in the contest between Hayes and Tilden, Rutherford B. Hayes and Samuel Tilden, it looked like Tilden had won the presidency, and it looked like, and it still looks like, he won the most popular votes. And but there were disputes over over the result in 3 states. So there were 3 states that actually sent competing slates of electors to Congress. They actually sent the state government. The state government basically sent to Congress and said the Democrats won in South Carolina and in Florida and in Louisiana, I believe. And the Republicans said, no, that's not true. The election was stolen. The Republicans actually won in these states. And Congress had to sort this out. And Congress sorted it out in favor of Republican Rutherford B. Hayes. He became president. The historical record still shows that Samuel Tilden had more popular votes. But that is not the whole story in that election, because when historians go back and look at what was happening in those states, in those elections, every historian that I've read who's looked at this closely concludes that the only reason that Tilden won those states is because of vote fraud. That if there had not been vote fraud, and there was a long, the North had its vote fraud in, tended to have a lot of vote fraud in urban political machines. The South had intense vote fraud. To the extent that in some precincts, you might go to vote as a Republican, you get your ballot, and you say, well, wait a second. There's only one choice on this ballot, and it's not a Republican. And they said, well, that's the ballot we printed. People, that was just one of the early attacks made on Republicans, was that, Republicans are a regional party in the North. And the Republicans would point out, well, you're actually not letting us compete in a lot of places in the South. But so 1876, most likely, right, the Electoral College is responsible for preventing vote fraud from stealing the White House in 1876. Most historians recognize that was true. And this is one of the beneficial effects of the Electoral College. It turns state boundaries into the equivalent of the watertight compartments on an ocean liner, right? If there's something that goes wrong, if there's fraud, at least it's contained within one individual state where it happened. So a stolen vote in Chicago has no effect on your vote in Oklahoma, choosing Oklahoma's electors, as long as national popular vote doesn't get their way, right? At least it's contained, and Congress was able to determine, again, what we think was the right result in 1876. Now, 1888 is another story, because 1888, the popular vote margin was wider. Grover Cleveland is a jeopardy question, because Grover Cleveland's the only person to serve 2 non-consecutive terms for president. He was president from 1884 to he's elected in 1884, so 1885 to 1889. He lost re-election in 1888, but he won the popular vote, and by a pretty handy margin. And so this is maybe the first of the elections like 2000, like 2016, that really one of the only 3, where the popular vote went one way, seems to have gone one way, and the Electoral College went the other way. Well, remember, we pictured in our minds the political map after the Civil War, right? How did Grover Cleveland win the most popular votes but lose the Electoral College? Well, he did it this way. He got 86% of the vote in South Carolina. He got over 70% of the vote in several other Deep South states, right? He was a regional candidate with intense popularity in one region of the country. But he wasn't a national candidate, right? The Republicans they just had broader support from the Eastern Seaboard, across the Midwest, into some of the new Western states, right? Exactly what the Electoral College is supposed to do, or at least has developed to do. It prevented regional extremism or intensity from controlling who won the White House. And you see this in the elections, both before and especially after this. What did the Democratic Party have to do? Because Grover Cleveland did come back and win another term in the White House. And of course, the Democrats did eventually return to being a national political party. Even though they retained their base in the South for a long time, what did they do? You see through this whole period of time, their intense support is in the South, but they're nominating candidates from the North and from the West. They're doing everything they can to reach out to other parts of the country because the Electoral College said regional intensity is not enough. You need a broader coalition. I mean, essentially, if I was speaking to a liberal audience, I really push this point, right? I mean, the Electoral College is sort of the celebrate diversity provision of our Constitution. Because I mean, you think about it from the Democrats' perspective. You're a Democrat strategist in the 1870s. And you're looking around, you're saying, we've got to win the White House, but we got this problem, right? We can win 30, maybe into the 40% in some of these northern states. We've got to win more votes. And you go up there and you walk around and you go into a place like Boston and you see, these Republicans in Massachusetts are really resting on their laurels. They have all of these people showing up and becoming new citizens from places like Ireland. But the Republicans in Massachusetts at the time looked down their noses on those people because they were new immigrants. A lot of them, some of them didn't speak English. A lot of them were Catholic. That was not, it was politically safe to just say, no, we don't need you in our coalition. So the Democrats realized eventually, right? Well, what if we appealed to these voters and bring them into our coalition? There's only one. What's the problem with that? If you're a Democrat in the 1870s and you want to reach out to Catholic voters, not super popular with some of the elements of your coalition in the South, right? But the Electoral College math says it's better for you to actually allow your coalition in the South to moderate a little bit. You don't need 76% of the vote or 86% of the vote, right? You can let that slip a little bit. What you need to do is reach out, bring more people into your party coalition. This is a very healthy thing in our system. And it's one of the reasons why I think the Electoral College actually works better than the framers thought it would. I don't know that they really foresaw these kind of effects, moderating our system and just creating an incentive to have broader political coalitions. But it does that. And it did that in the 1870s, in the 1880s. And then you get to 2000. And what did we all pass around after the 2000 election? The same thing that we passed around after the 2016 election, the county map, right? You've all seen the county map, right? The county red-blue map from 2016, and looks like we're all old enough to talk about 2000 as well, right? The county-by-county map that shows just how narrow Al Gore's coalition was, right? Al Gore in 2001, big cities and a couple Indian reservations. You remember that map? Right? I mean, that's what it was. That's why I learned where the Indian reservations were in South Dakota because of the counties Al Gore won. That was all. I mean, that's all the guy won. He lost his home state. I mean, it was pathetic. It was pathetic. And Hillary Clinton redid the whole thing in 2016, which is extra pathetic, right? I mean, you think about that. They just went through this 16 years ago, right? And the Electoral College hasn't changed in that time. And what the Trump campaign did was brilliant, right? It was exactly what the Electoral College says to do. Reach out to the states where your party's been losing by a small margin for a long time, figure out how to make the appeal. And I mean, they did it, they executed on it, and they won exactly the way the system is supposed to work. These are not failures of the Electoral College. These are the Electoral College's greatest triumphs, right? 2016, 2000, 1888, 1876. These are triumphs of our constitutional system, not flaws. But because people haven't studied this, people don't know this. I mean, I think it was mentioned a couple times before, right? I mean, it's so important to help our young people learn about the Constitution because they're not getting this anymore. And when people are surprised by something and it doesn't work the way they expect it to work, the natural reaction is to oppose it. Which frankly is why on this Electoral College fight, I love it because I'll go and sit down with a legislator. I've had this happen to me probably a dozen times. Sit down with a legislator who's a co-sponsor of the National Popular Vote Compact, talk them through all this, and they'll say, well, I'm going to go walk down and take my name off this bill, right? Because they just don't know the history. And they had this kind of visceral reaction to something that they didn't fully understand. And once they understand it, they're willing to change their position because frankly, it's not anything anybody campaigned on for the most part either. So it's safe for legislators to learn about and change their position. And it's been a lot of fun to work on. So national popular vote, what is this? What is this new threat to the Electoral College? Because it is very clever. And I give credit to the folks who came up with this. John Koza is a computer scientist from California. He was an Al Gore elector in 2000. So obviously he came away from that frustrated, but he's a smart guy. He co-patented the scratch-off lottery ticket. So he's not just a computer scientist. He wins on every scratch ticket. I don't know exactly how wealthy he is, but he's extremely wealthy. And he has plowed, I was told that initially he pledged to spend at least $12 million on this, and I suspect that he has spent more than that. But they looked at the Constitution, and they noticed that, as we talked about at the beginning, right, legislators can decide how to award their state's electoral votes. And they've done it lots of different ways, right? Maine and Nebraska still do it by congressional district, or actually have gone back to doing it by congressional district, which some states did in the beginning, where, you know, each congressional district awards one elector, and then they do the last two based on the statewide vote. Everybody else is winner take all right now, but states used to just directly appoint them. Some states have done it proportional. States have options, and that's a good thing. The pollen count right now is not a good thing. But it is good that states have options. So what they said is, what if you went to a state and said, why don't you just ignore how the people vote in your state and elect your state's electors, appoint your state's electors based on the national popular vote, not the state popular vote, but the national popular vote. And now, of course, no state would do that on its own, because it would be unilateral disarmament, right? So what if we did this with an interstate compact that says that my state pledges to do this, if enough states also pledge to do this, that it will control the outcome of the election. So the National Popular Vote Interstate Compact has a trigger. It only takes effect if it's adopted by enough states that they control 270 electoral votes, which controls the outcome of the election. This is very clever. I mean, this is very clever, right? Because, I mean, the left has been beating its head against the wall for decades trying to amend the Constitution to get rid of the Electoral College. And you've seen this, you know, there are new resolutions in Congress right now to try to do this, but they've never been able to get it done that way because it's hard. It's hard to change the Constitution. But they came up with a much easier way because, frankly, you could do this with, you know, if you got all of the biggest states, you do this with a dozen states. Right. And even if you're not getting, you know, even if you're not going to get Texas, they've got California, they've got New York, right? They are almost to 200 electoral votes with this interstate compact. So how else does it work? And then I'll talk about some of the particular flaws of it and the risks of it, probably kind of obvious after we talk through the history, but we'll talk about some of the problems with this. So how does this work? So National Popular Vote Interstate Compact, it claims that states can't drop out before the election to try to make it harder for them to game the system. And it just, one of the practical aspects of this that I find fascinating is that who actually decides what the national popular vote result is, right? Because nobody does that. I mean, CNN does that, and MSNBC does that, and Fox News and New York Times, right? The media adds up all these vote totals, but there is no national popular vote total that ever gets certified in a presidential election. Every state would do it on its own under the National Popular Vote Interstate Compact. So Oklahoma would have to certify, well, if Oklahoma was in the compact, would have to certify what it believed was the national popular vote total. You would literally have 51 different certifications. And of course, going along with that, the fact that this isn't a constitutional amendment, it's just sort of a kind of an attempt to add on to or hijack the Electoral College system. There really isn't a national popular vote. Every state would have different ballot access laws, different voter qualifications, different ways of carrying out the election, different ways of doing recounts. The national popular vote, I mean, you can imagine a scenario under national popular vote where the national margin is very thin, but it wouldn't necessarily be thin enough in any state to trigger a state's current recount laws, right? States would at least have to change their laws to make that work, and states would still conduct recounts differently, right? I mean, it is, and I say all this to suggest one thing that I believe about this, that I cannot prove, but it is what I believe. I do not believe that national popular vote is really designed, intentionally or unintentionally, to be the final answer on the Electoral College. I don't know, I just can't know if the people who created it intended it to be this way or not. But when you really dig into the National Popular Vote Interstate Compact, it's so unstable. To me, it strikes me more like throwing sand in the gears to force a constitutional amendment that would centralize election power. And the groups that support it on the left, Demos Foundation, which is a George Soros group based out in New York, Fair Vote, which is a partly Soros-funded organization out of D.C. The groups that support it on the left support it as part of an agenda to centralize power over elections in Washington, D.C., right? This is what they want. And you can't, it's very hard to do that while you have the Electoral College in place because there's no national election. There's no reason to centralize power over elections in D.C. But as soon as you have a national election, I mean, think about what would happen in Oklahoma if national popular vote was the law of the land. So either, if we adopted it in particular, this would become an issue. And you're watching on TV what's going on in Chicago. And they've got footage of some real election chicanery going on in Chicago, right? We would want that dealt with. Who would we turn to, right? There's no state official in Oklahoma who can help us with that. We would be forced to turn to the federal government, right? Conservatives would be forced to support the election agenda of the left to demand more federal control of elections because it would be the only way to attempt to have redress against left-wing election fraud in other places. So I mean, this is really what I think all this is about, or at least where it would head if they got their way and got the National Popular Vote Interstate Compact. It is unstable. It's also, I believe, unconstitutional. I mean, for one thing, the Constitution actually prohibits interstate compacts unless Congress approves them. The problem with that is, and this is why, I've had people say, well, it's unconstitutional. We shouldn't worry about it. No, I don't have that kind of faith in judges. Hopefully none of you have that kind of faith in judges. Did you know that the Supreme Court has never enforced the Compact Clause? They have never enforced the Compact Clause. They have basically said, well, that just means that, Congress can veto interstate compacts that they don't like. So, because they've had challenges to various interstate compacts in the past, and the court has always just said, well, Congress might get around to approving them. We're not going to find that the Constitution actually means what it says. So I'm not optimistic that they would strike it down for that reason. It also, however, it does violate what we know is the purpose of the Electoral College in the beginning, which was to allow states to select the president and to give legislators the power. If you look at Article 2 of the Constitution, the electors belong to the state, and the legislature gets to decide how to appoint them. And that's actually important. The electors don't belong to the legislature. They belong to the state. Who is the state? The state is the people of the state. Now, it's not a problem if electors directly appoint them because if legislators directly appoint electors because we elected the legislators. But if legislators say, well, we're going to select our state's electors based on what voters in California do. To me, that is infringing on, or that is violating the fact that those electors belong to the state. And it was pointed out to me earlier that the 14th Amendment seems to sort of incorporate that idea, although there's no case law on that. I mean, this is the problem with all of this, and really why I started this project. I just don't trust judges to get this one right, particularly because of standing rules. And some of you are familiar with the rules of standing to get into court. The problem with trying to sue and challenge national popular vote, if it took effect, is that you would probably have to do it after an election took place. It's not clear that you could do it ahead of time. And so think about going to a judge and saying, well, we just had an election. Well, the candidates were both operating under the assumption that this was the set of rules, but I want you to strike down that set of rules. Most judges do not have the backbone to do that. And so I really believe that we have to beat this on the ground in state legislatures and even in Colorado right now. Colorado is one of the most recent states to adopt this. There's a major grassroots effort going on to gather signatures and challenge this in a referendum vote this November and repeal it. Yeah. Yeah, you want me to share that?
2012.
It was 2014. It was right before I moved here, I think.
Okay. In 2014, I couldn't remember the exact year, the Oklahoma House of Representatives passed the national popular vote by one vote. They signed on to it by one vote.
Well, they didn't sign on to it. It did pass the chamber of the legislature here, and that actually was the second time ever I came to Oklahoma.
It passed the House by one vote. I remember it well because a bunch of 912ers and some other conservative folks in the state caught it.
Yeah.
And we descended on the Senate. First of all, I wrote Fred Jordan, who was my rep, and I told him, what the hell are you thinking? Are you a total idiot or just a partial idiot? Because if the national popular vote had been in effect during the Al Gore Bush election, even though Oklahoma voted overwhelmingly for Bush, all of our electoral votes would have gone to Gore. That disenfranchises every person in Oklahoma. But that passed the House, we descended on the Senate, and we made it so toxic they never brought it to the floor.
They can't even get a bill sponsor. They were trying this year to get a bill sponsor.
And why
They
did it pass the House? Because the national popular vote people sponsored some junkets to the Caribbean on a cruise. And last session, they sponsored a trip to New York City or Las Vegas. I can't remember. I think
it was
which.
New York City. They go all over the country.
Anyway, and so the same dweebs that just, have no clue what's going on in the world and have no, you'd be amazed at the number of people in the legislature that don't have even the barest knowledge of the functioning of government.
Some of the ones that went on those junkets got reelected too.
Oh, I have no doubt about it. But it's easier to pass than you think.
Yeah, here.
I remember real well checking into that at the time. Donna and I spent 2.5 hours with one of their representatives, not because we were interested, but because we wanted to find out what they were actually peddling. And but I remember well that there were several junkets they had. They offered trips to Scottsdale that somebody did for golfing weekends, take your friends and family, all expenses paid, top locations, country clubs, everything paid, to study this issue. It was pure bribery, and a whole bunch of them fell for those trips. And they had them to Florida, and we got the trips to the Caribbean canceled by protesting it timely.
Yeah, this is, make sure I know what time it is here. So, no, this is so national popular vote has always had an easy time with blue states. I mean, they got this passed right away in Maryland, Illinois, New Jersey, And as since then, they've picked up California, although we gave them a real fight for it in California and Washington State. But as time has gone by, they've picked off all of the blue trifectas, right? All of the states where Democrats control the House, the Senate, and the governor's office. They have almost all of those. And of course, they've just picked up this session Colorado, New Mexico, and Delaware. Delaware actually is a state. It's been a Democrat trifecta for a long time, but we had held them off because they had a lot of Democrats there who actually understood why this was a bad idea. But as the Democrats in the legislature in Delaware become much more progressive, they finally passed that this year. They're working on Nevada, which is another new Democrat trifecta state. We've stopped them this year in Maine. I think. The bill is, sort of as dead as it can be until they actually sine a die in Maine, and we stopped them in New Hampshire. Although I think the governor there would veto it because they still do have a Republican governor in Maine, or excuse me, in New Hampshire. But it's almost a challenge for them, right? They picked up all these blue states. And it makes it more obvious what's going on. So they've been desperate to win red states, and this is what they do. They go into a red. They did the same thing in Arizona, and they got it past the chamber in Arizona too. And they had done this. They'd done this in Nebraska, which was scarier for me because Nebraska only has one chamber. Yeah, I did have a legislator in Nebraska very angry at me and sent a letter to the whole OCPA board complaining that it was unethical that I had pointed out that he went on one of these trips. Actually, it was he said it was unethical that I was pointed out that legislators had gone on these trips. He kind of implied that he hadn't gone on these trips, but his Instagram feed showed otherwise. This is what they do. I mean, they've done this over and over, not just with legislators too. In Michigan, they actually did a trip. They took the editorial page editor of one of the Michigan newspapers. They were trying to take members of conservative groups like this, right? Trying to find people in positions of influence among conservative grassroots. And look, if you get an invitation, take it. No, take it. Go spy and spend their money. I've had other people have done this for me. No, it is important to know what they're doing. Actually, they wouldn't bring the conservative grassroots people and on the same trip as the legislators because I think they knew that they were probably going to get some spies in the one. But no, I mean they had a majority of Republican Michigan state senators sponsor a bill last year that they tried to get through the lame duck session in Michigan because Michigan has a year-round legislature, so they had a lame duck session after the election, which was so interesting, right? I mean, they know it's unpopular. We got so many people to go to the Michigan State Capitol and walk around and talk to legislators that it killed the bill, and they haven't actually even introduced a bill this year at all. So I'm hopeful there. But this, I mean, they are intensely focused with their money on winning red states. And so they were here this year. They were walking the halls of the Oklahoma legislature just a couple of months ago trying to find a bill sponsor, right? I think they didn't know how our rules work because it was already after the deadline. But I didn't tell them. But they'll be back here, and if you have friends in other states, especially Colorado, where this is a fight right now, or just on social media, I try to run a pretty active Facebook page to let people know what's going on and just share information on this. It is so important to educate grassroots people who are engaged because frankly, it's. I've talked to people about the strategy on this, and sometimes you get people who say, "Oh, you got to run it. Let's run a big educational campaign, or we need to run Facebook ads to everybody and their brother and all this stuff." And I remind people it's just not how the process works, right? You don't need 1 million people to defeat national popular vote. All we need is a few dozen people in each of our red states and, hopefully in as many purple states as we can get to who oppose this. And, man cannot live by bread alone, and NPV cannot win by blue states alone. They are pretty much at their high water mark as far as blue states, unless we have a really bad state legislative election nationwide. You know, they're close to 200 electoral votes. They've got about 80 to go. We can hold them there as long as conservative, activist people are willing to go and fight this when it comes up in our state legislatures. So with that, I'm glad to take any questions about this or anything else that OCPA is working on. But thanks for letting me talk about the Electoral College.
Is there some kind of sunset agreement in this national vote as far as the 270, or however long they're going to be leaving this open for these states to accumulate?
Yeah, there's no sunset. That's part of why we're always keeping our eyes open for where we can get it repealed. You know, most of the states that have adopted it, especially up until this year, were so deep blue that, I mean, there are repeal bills in Connecticut and New Jersey every year, but they won't even give them a hearing there. But yeah, there's no, I mean, that is the other risk with this. I mean, it's designed to just linger out there.
So eventually, as states maybe roll over from blue to red and reverse red to blue, they could physically turn around and collect more than the 270.
Yeah. Oh, that's true.
And it only would take one legislator to get it passed and run through
Yeah.
the system.
I would tell you, you know, one good thing is when you look at their states, they have they passed in blue states. Almost all of those states are losing population, or their population is growing slower than the national average. So what happens after 2000? They lose some, in reapportionment, they lose some congressional districts. They'll actually lose between 3 and 5 electoral votes after the 2000 census. Well, and think about, and we'll get to you in just a second, but think about how this works under national popular vote. If you had, I was just saying this on my podcast this morning, if you had 2 states side by side, and one's a red state, one's a blue state. The red state has really good election integrity laws. So, you know, we're trying to get people to vote at the polls if they can. We're asking for photo ID. We're not letting felons vote unless they go through a process. And the blue state says, we trust you. Come on, come all. We trust you. Which state has more political power under NPV? The blue state has more political power under NPV. And I mean, they have an incentive to look the other way. Yeah, I mean, I think the incentives that NPV would set up for vote fraud are really, really concerning. I used to call it the Acorn Revitalization Act, but not enough people remember anymore. So, sir.
Now, how independent are the electors? Can they break party and vote for somebody else?
So
Does that happen in a national popular vote?
Well, so there are different theories on whether electors can be bound or not. Most states today claim to bind electors. There are some lawsuits in the federal courts right now about that. And you know, there again, there's kind of a standing question about whether you can even suit a challenge unless it makes a difference. Because of how NPV works, right? If Oklahoma was a part of the compact and Oklahoma goes 70% Republican, but the national popular vote is 51% Democrat, Oklahoma would actually appoint the Democrat electors. So you really wouldn't, you'd have the same situation today where the only time you have a quote unquote faithless elector is really when there's just somebody protesting, not trying to change the outcome of the election. I think that would continue under national popular vote. So yeah, I don't think it would have that effect.
For the 2016 election for this area. And wanted desperately to change Oklahoma's binding laws because I see them as an unconstitutional infringement on the office of elector, because the elector is to be independent. Just think for a moment, no matter who you support as president, if a president decided they were going to go off the rails and declare themselves to be dictator, and they did that before the Electoral College sat, would you not want the elector to vote the principles for which you voted rather than a dictator who is unconstitutional in any way, shape, or form?
Well, actually, the elector does not have to vote when party or people are elected.
Exactly.
And elect anybody, even in a different party.
And that's very true. So the point is, and this is the funny thing about our law, even though it is law, and they forced me several times under threat of having my seat taken away from me to sign an oath that I was going to vote per the election, basically just be a rubber stamp. And I signed it under duress. I desperately wanted to change that law, but couldn't because I had given my own word to vote according to the election, and so and had no reason to change. So we couldn't make that happen through the courts. But it is something that we have to think about, because that is yet another end around for national popular vote. Because if they end up saying, oh, well, you can't change and give electors from the other party, they can come back and try to dictate to you as to how you place your vote. And so anyway, that's all I had to say on that.
Yeah.
Trent, I have a question for you. Have any states ever looked at doing basically the same electoral college system within the state? We were discussing, I had family here from California the last few days, and we were talking about what I believe that if in California, if the votes were based on an electoral college system within the state, it's much redder than what it shows up in the national elections. And I think the state would probably elect somebody other than Gavin Newsom.
Yeah. Yeah, and I know this, when I lived in Washington State, this topic would come up a lot because, Washington State, you might not know this, it's a red state. It just has a blue hole in it called Seattle. Exactly. And, it is not that I know of. I don't know of any state that has done that. It used to be that the protection in many states was that the state senates were actually apportioned by geography. And that was struck down by the U.S. Supreme Court in, I think it was Reynolds v. Sims, which is really an outrage. It's actually one of the most outrageous judicial activist cases that there is, because how can it be unconstitutional for a state to organize its state government the way the federal government is organized in the Constitution? Although, the problem, I've gone back and listened to the oral argument in that case, and like some of these arguments we have over the Constitution, it is slavery is the American original sin, right? And there was a real problem that states were using their state senates to perpetuate racism by apportioning them in a way that had that effect. So the case was an abuse to the Constitution, but also sort of a result of some abuses by state governments. But no, it is. People have made that argument, right? That no, we'd rather our states have a system like this too, especially in a big state. And you're starting to see this in Oklahoma, right, where you start to wind up with this really distinct urban, suburban, rural divide. The framers were brilliant in how they set all this up.
Any other questions for Trent?
Yeah.
Okay.
I got a question.
All right.
It's gonna be one that's kind of switches. Has there ever been a bond slave president?
What's that?
A bond slave president?
Bond slave president? I'm not sure what you mean.
What do you mean by that?
Well, a person was a bond slave, a white person.
Oh, and
Andrew
some
Johnson,
Andrew Johnson.
Tennessee.
Okay.
He was Lincoln's vice president, and when Lincoln was assassinated, he became president.
Yeah.
He was a bond slave.
Okay. He was almost impeached, but wasn't. Or almost removed. He was impeached. No, not removed.
he was their Clinton.
That's right. That's right.
Sort of.
Well, thank you all so much. I left handouts on the table. Let me know if you need any. Thank you.